The war criminals sat in the dock at Nuremberg, their eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. Behind them, interpreting their every word with perfect fluency, stood American officers who spoke German like natives. What these Nazi defendants didn't immediately realize would shake them to their core. Many of those officers were Jewish. Captain Samuel Stern adjusted his headphones and began translating. His family had fled Frankfurt in 1938. Now he was back, ensuring that every lie, every justification, every attempt at denial was faithfully recorded for history. The irony was devastating. The very people Hitler tried to erase were now documenting his regime's crimes. But this moment at Nuremberg was just the final chapter. The real shock had begun months earlier, when American forces first rolled into German cities. And what German civilians discovered left them speechless. Let's go back to that pivotal moment in spring 1945. Picture a German farmer walking into a requisition office in Bavaria. He needs permission to keep part of his harvest. Behind the desk sits a U.S. Army captain with a nameplate reading Lieutenant Cohen. The farmer stops dead in his tracks. A Jew in command of food distribution? For 12 long years, Nazi propaganda had hammered one message into German minds. Jews were weak, cowardly, parasitic. They couldn't lead anyone, not even themselves. Yet here was Lieutenant Cohen. Calm, authoritative, making decisions about who ate and who went hungry. That scene played out thousands of times across occupied Germany. In Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, and countless smaller towns. German civilians kept encountering American officers with distinctly Jewish surnames. The psychological whiplash was overwhelming. Many of these officers were Ritchie boys, Jewish refugees who had fled Hitler's regime as children. They'd grown up in America, mastered English, and returned in uniform. Imagine being a German stopped at a checkpoint. The American lieutenant questioning you speaks perfect German. His nameplate reads Goldberg or Rosenbaum. Your world just turned upside down. Some German civilians whispered among themselves in disbelief. "Are you sure he's Jewish?" they'd ask. "He doesn't look like the posters." The grotesque caricatures from Der Stürmer newspaper bore no resemblance to these confident, disciplined officers. Reality was destroying 12 years of lies. But the shock went even deeper than daily encounters. Jewish American officers were among the first Allied soldiers to enter concentration camps. When Captain Abraham Levine walked through Dachau's gates in April 1945, survivors couldn't believe their eyes. Here was a Jew in American uniform, not starving, not cowering, but commanding troops. When Levine spoke to survivors in Yiddish, some broke down weeping, not just from relief, but from the profound symbolism. The Jewish people hadn't been erased. They had returned as liberators. For German civilians forced to tour these camps, the revelation was shattering. The officer showing them the horrors was often Jewish himself. The very people they'd been told were subhuman were now revealing the monstrous reality of what had been done in their name. How did this extraordinary reversal of fortune come to be? The story begins decades earlier, with waves of Jewish immigration to America. Starting in the late 1800s, Jewish families fled persecution across Europe. Pogroms in Russia, discrimination in Poland, economic hardship in Germany and Austria. By the 1920s, over 3 million Jews had reached American shores. They settled in crowded tenements, worked brutal hours in factories, ran small shops. But they invested everything in education. Parents pushed their children into universities, law schools, professional careers. That investment paid off spectacularly. By the 1930s, The sons of those immigrants were entering the U.S. military as officers, educated men who had mastered English, earned degrees, proven their leadership potential. The timing was perfect and terrible. As Nazi Germany stripped Jews of citizenship through the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, America was commissioning Jewish graduates from West Point and Columbia as officers. Two paths diverged dramatically. In Berlin, Jewish students were expelled from schools. In New York, Jewish students were being trained to lead battalions. When Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, the refugee crisis intensified. Thousands more Jewish families sought entry to America. While immigration quotas limited the numbers, those who escaped often sent their children into military service. It was a way to prove loyalty to their new homeland, and it was deeply personal. These weren't abstract patriots fighting for democracy. They were fighting the very ideology that had driven their families from their homes. By Pearl Harbor in December 1941, an entire generation of Jewish Americans was ready to serve. Their motivation wasn't duty alone. It was vengeance wrapped in justice. Lieutenant Colonel Leon Bass grew up in Philadelphia, hearing about relatives trapped in Europe. When he marched into Germany, he carried the weight of his family's story. Major Murray Shubin commanded armored units that rolled through the Reich. His parents had fled Poland just years before the war began. These officers weren't exceptions. They were part of a massive mobilization. More than 500,000 Jewish Americans served in World War II. Of these, roughly 50,000 became officers, captains, majors, colonels leading men into battle. The numbers were staggering. In any German city occupied by Americans, the odds of encountering a Jewish officer were actually very high. Take General Morris Rose, the highest-ranking Jewish officer killed in the war. He commanded the 3rd Armored Division, one of the spearhead units that broke into Germany. Rose was famous for his courage, often riding at the front with his troops. When he died in March 1945, even his enemies recognized the loss of a formidable leader. For German civilians who later learned his background, the idea that a Jew had led such a devastating force was almost impossible to process. The propaganda had promised them that Jews were unfit to lead. The battlefield proved the opposite. Jewish officers weren't just present in combat roles. They excelled in intelligence, speaking fluent German or Yiddish. They questioned prisoners of war, analyzed captured documents, predicted enemy movements. Many had intimate knowledge of German culture, having grown up in German-speaking households before fleeing to America. This made them incredibly effective interrogators. Picture a former Gestapo officer being questioned by Major David Rosen. The Nazi realizes his interrogator is Jewish. The tables haven't just turned, they've been obliterated. That psychological warfare was devastating. Every encounter chipped away at Nazi ideology, but it was the face-to-face meetings with civilians that really shattered the propaganda machine. In town halls across Germany, Jewish officers administered military government. They issued permits, organized food distribution, established new local governments. For a German mayor who had once signed anti-Semitic decrees, taking orders from a Jewish American captain was the ultimate reversal of fortune. The humiliation wasn't lost on anyone. Some civilians asked bluntly, "Are you Jewish?" They expected denial, shame, perhaps anger. Instead, these officers answered with pride. They knew their presence alone was rewriting history. Every signature on a document, every order given, every decision made, was proof that the Nazi myth had collapsed. The contrast was brutal. Jewish chaplains, often holding officer rank, led religious services for American troops right in the heart of defeated Germany. To walk past a bombed church and hear Hebrew prayers under U.S. protection was unthinkable just months before. The very faith the Nazis tried to erase was now openly practiced, guarded by armed American soldiers. These weren't quiet moments of worship either. They were public declarations that Hitler had failed. Jewish officers also played visible roles in denazification programs. They interviewed former Nazi party members, decided who could return to positions of authority, who needed re-education. The irony was inescapable. The people declared enemies of civilization were now determining who was fit for civilized society. For German families, the psychological impact rippled through generations. Children saw their parents take orders from Jewish officers. The worldview they'd inherited began to crack. In schools reopened under Allied supervision, German children sometimes realized their teachers answered to Jewish officers. That inversion of authority planted seeds of doubt about everything they'd been taught. Not all reactions were acceptance. Pockets of resentment lingered. Some Germans muttered privately that Jewish officers were seeking revenge disguised as liberation. But even that bitterness acknowledged the fact. Jews were present, visible, and powerful in the new order. Whether accepted or resisted, their authority couldn't be denied. The discovery forced a national reckoning. If the Nazis had lied about Jews, what else had they lied about? That question haunted Germany for decades. Some civilians admitted they couldn't reconcile the Jewish officers they met with the grotesque images from Nazi propaganda. These were disciplined, decorated men commanding respect from their troops. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. By late 1945, the psychological fallout was complete. German civilians had to process that the very people they'd been told were subhuman were now calmly managing the rebuilding of their nation. That reality worked its way into the national consciousness. Over time, it became part of Germany's slow reckoning with its past. The legacy extended far beyond Germany's borders. For the Jewish community worldwide, this moment was transformative. The Holocaust had nearly destroyed European Jewry, but the visibility of Jewish American officers in victory gave survivors pride and vindication. It showed that Jews weren't passive victims of history. They were active participants in shaping its course. These officers symbolized resilience. Children of immigrants who returned to Europe not in chains, but in command. In America, Jewish veterans returned home to a country that began seeing them differently. Their service, their medals, their sacrifices helped break down barriers of anti-Semitism. By the 1950s, Jewish Americans were increasingly visible in politics, business, culture. Their military contributions provided undeniable proof of patriotism. The shock of 1945 became a generational memory. In German classrooms decades later, children learned not only of the Holocaust, but also of the irony that Jews returned as liberators. That irony carried moral weight heavier than any Allied tank. For the Nazi defendants at Nuremberg, facing Jewish officers in the courtroom was the final humiliation. The people they'd tried to erase were documenting their crimes for history. Captain Stern continued translating, his voice steady and professional. He was the son of refugees, now ensuring that justice would be served. The presence of Jewish officers became more than a wartime footnote. It was proof that hatred had failed, that survival had turned into strength. For German civilians who lived through it, the lesson was unforgettable. The people meant to be erased had walked back into Germany with authority, justice, and dignity. And for the world, it remains one of history's most powerful testaments to resilience in the face of hatred. The war had ended with a revelation that shook an entire nation. The very people demonized by Nazi propaganda had stood at the heart of the army that crushed the Reich. That contradiction forced Germany to confront 12 years of lies. And in that confrontation, the seeds of a different future were planted.